All right, so welcome back. 14:30 on the dot. We want to make sure that we're keeping care of everybody's time. So for the second panel, sorry, we heard about all the space capabilities, but what are they going to do to us, and what can we do to them? What are they worried about? And everything that is Counterspace. So again, you can see the speakers' bios. They're up online. I won't belabor the point. They are absolutely experts in the field, and we're super happy to have them join us. And I won't belabor the point, but certainly we are very humbled that they've taken some time out of their busy days to come and help us look at this, which should be a fantastic conversation. So I'm not sure you guys have a preferred order, or you just want to, you can Rochambeau for it, or whoever fires the first shot. But I see Brian unmuting first, so.
Well, I was just going to say, I think I assumed I was going, so I've got sort of like some introductory, broad overview stuff that I was going to talk about, if that's okay with it.
Yep. Right. That works terrific, and then we'll roll on from there. If you have slides, you can push them yourself. There you go, perfect.
Okay.
And I will drop off and hand it over to you.
All right, so just presently saying that, so I'm Brian Whedon with the Secure World Foundation. Like Kevin on the previous panel, I exist entirely in the public open source world these days, so I'm going to talk about, and my slide deck here, my remarks comes from that research. My comments are going to focus mainly on the Counterspace issues you brought up, but my organization, we participated in a lot of the international UN meetings that were talked about in the previous session, so I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A if that comes up. So Counterspace capabilities. I want to start by going through what we mean when we talk about Counterspace capabilities. That sometimes gets lost. The way that we talk about it, and like in our report I'm going to mention in a minute here, the first are direct ascent. And these are weapons that use a missile launched from the ground, air, or sea with an interceptor or interceptors on top. And that interceptor kinetically destroys satellites to the force of impact. So there's no bomb, it doesn't explode, it just runs into the satellite, and that's how it destroys the satellite. But that interceptor is not on orbit itself. It goes up in a ballistic arc, and then it comes back down. The second category are co-orbital weapons, and these are weapons that actually are placed into orbit. They're satellites themselves. And then they maneuver to approach a target, and they can attack it by various means. They could also run into it. They could, explode and hit it with some sort of fragmentation, or they could have other kinds of non-destructive means on board. Direct energy weapons, which in the space context, just like they are on Earth, they use focused energy, such as laser, particle, microwave beams. Most of these currently exist in the space world are non-destructive. In other words, they're like shining a green laser in somebody's eyes. They're more of a dazzling or temporary than they are permanently destructive, but certainly there are goals to develop permanently destructive down the road. Electronic warfare, so these are weapons that use radio frequency energy to interfere with or jam communications to or from satellites. Important thing to keep in mind is that electronic warfare can either go after the satellite, or in some cases just the reception of the satellite signals terrestrial. Cyber came up a little bit on the first panel. Just like other domains in the space domain, they're weapons that use software network techniques to go after computer systems. Importantly, in the space context, you can think about both cyber attacks against the computer systems and networks used to do command and control of satellites, against the satellites themselves, or against the end user devices that are trying to receive and make use of satellite signals. And actually, of those three links, oftentimes cyber attacks against the user segment or against the ground segment are sometimes a lot easier to pull off than cyber attacks against the satellites themselves. And then finally is the category we call space situation awareness, or what the US military now calls space domain awareness. This is knowledge about the space environment and human space activities. And it's important because it's not unique to Counterspace. We use SSA to also avoid collisions or keep track of orbital debris. But SSA, SDA enables both offensive and defensive Counterspace operations. So if you want to be able to detect and characterize threats and potential attacks against your satellites, you've got to have SSA. Likewise, if you want to be able to target another country's satellites, you have to have SSA. So we track it as part of Counterspace because it's a critically enabling thing. So this is the assessment that we have of China's current counterspace capabilities across all those various categories, based on our most recent report, and I've got a link to that at the end of my slides here. Where you see a G, a green G, that means that we have seen significant evidence in the public domain to indicate they have some capability. Either they're doing R&D on those things, they're actively testing them in space, or they may even be operational. Yellow means that we've seen some evidence they're working on it, but it's not quite as a convincing case as the G. And red means we haven't seen any evidence to that. And if you look across this chart, we see, as Kevin indicated in the first panel, China's working on a broad range of counterspace capabilities. They're working on direct ascent, which most publicly they tested in 2007 by destroying one of their own satellites. But that same system, or a variant of that system, was tested in 2005, 2006, 2007, 2010, 2013, 14, 15, and I believe 17. So there's indications that it's a sophisticated, robust program, and there's also some signs that it's probably operationally deployed. On the direct ascent against medium Earth and geostationary Earth orbit, these are higher altitude orbits. They conducted one test in 2013 that we assessed was probably an ASAT test, but we haven't seen anything else since then. We've seen under the co-orbital, we've seen China, like Russia and the US, test the ability to get close to other satellites. We call rendezvous and proximity operations, but we haven't seen anything in the public domain that would indicate those are specifically weapons testing designed to attack satellites. We have seen some of that from the Russians. We've not seen that from China. We certainly have seen indications they're working on directed energy, although it's really hard to assess where that stands. We're pretty sure that they've got really good electronic warfare capabilities, and they certainly have some pretty good space situation awareness capabilities, although not nearly as good as what the US has. I just want to note that the R's there, use in conflict, I think, is an important context here. A lot of the counter-space capabilities we're seeing tested and used, we make a distinction between what is being tested sort of outside of a combat conflict and what is being used operationally in an armed conflict or by the militaries. We've seen widespread use of electronic warfare in conflict, or in military conflicts, in military operations by Russia, for example, and probably by China. We have not seen yet any country use a laser weapon or a direct ascent weapon or a covert weapon against another country's satellite as part of an armed conflict. It's all been testing against your own satellites, that sort of a thing. Couple of examples of what we're talking about here. On the left is a commercial satellite image of a transporter erector launcher, TEL, that is sitting on a pad at Xichang, which is one of their big space launch complexes. This is the pad that was built to the southeast of the Space Launch Complex. And this is most likely the launch vehicle for that test I mentioned in 2013 that went nearly to the geostationary belt. You can kind of see from the shadow there that you've got sort of a TEL where it has the missile raised, and it's a good sized missile. On the right, you have another commercial image of what is probably a direct energy site near Bohu, Xizang. This is actually not that far from a place called Korla, which is a site where they've done a lot of testing of some of their anti-satellite weapons. So there's a question, is there some link between the anti-satellite weapons and the direct energy testing? But what you see here are shelters where you can slide the roof back, which is fairly commonly seen with large optics that you would need for ground-based directed energy weapons. And then the gas storage tanks are there for gases to cool the lasers. So this is one of several sites that we've been able to identify through commercial activities. So I just want one more thing before I close out here. This whole notion of anti-satellite testing and the militarization, weaponization of space is getting a lot of airtime these days. I just want to remind everybody that this is not a new phenomenon. The United States and the Soviet Union conducted something on the order of 50 anti-satellite tests between 1959 and 1995, where the US conducted the first one, 1959. There was a brief period between 95 and 2005 where we didn't have any anti-satellite tests in space. But since 2005, there's been roughly 20 conducted by China, Russia, the US, and India. So this is more of a return to sort of the challenges we were dealing with during the Cold War, with the main difference, of course, being there's more countries involved. These may have been the 4 countries that have tested ASAT weapons, but there's certainly a short list of 4, 5, maybe 6 other countries that have the technology to do this, should they choose to. And part of what we're seeing is a growing number of countries exploring offensive and defensive counter-space capabilities, because they themselves are looking to protect their satellites, or they're looking to be able to interfere with another country's satellites should they be involved in a conflict, and that country's using satellites for reconnaissance, for imagery, for communications against them. So I'll just conclude by showing this, and yes, I'm more than happy to make these slides available. Just links to our report, which has all the details you probably ever want to find in the public domain on what China, as well as a whole bunch of other countries, are doing on counter-space capabilities, and then a great report from CSIS that I think Todd's going to talk about. But if not, it's really good where they talk about sort of how you defend against some of these capabilities. So I will stop there, and more than happy to answer questions when we get to that part of the program.
All right, there we go. Thank you very much. Well, with that segue, Todd, you want to go next? And just
Sure.
There we go. All right, we'll hand it off to you.
All right, let me get my my screen up here. Got a few slides there. There. You see my slides?
Yep, there we go. They're up.
Provide a copy of these to folks later if they'd like to go back and see them. But yeah, I just want to kind of build on where Brian left off. And full disclosure, this is a team effort in the independent think tank community. There aren't a lot of us, so Brian and Victoria and the other folks, Secure World Foundation, we collaborate with them a lot, in the work that we're doing. And so, shown here are 3 of our more recent reports I think are relevant to what we're talking about today. In the middle is our most recent space threat assessment, which is a companion product by design to what Brian was talking about, that the Secure World Foundation produces each year as well. We both do these in parallel. And on the left-hand side was a report that we did, a one-off report this year called Defense Against the Dark Arts in Space. The Harry Potter reference is intentional, but you don't have to be a Harry Potter fan to understand it. In this report, we go in and look at the other side of the equation. We know that there are all these threats out there. We know that China, Russia, and others are making advancements in their counter-space capabilities. What can you do about it? And I think if we don't talk about that, you lead people with them, to the mistaken conclusion that space is not defendable, right? And so I'll talk a little bit about that. On the right-hand side, another report that we did last year is just looking at how do other countries view space weapons, and what is a space weapon, and how can you tell the difference between a counter-space weapon, a protective system that you may put on or near your satellites, and some other form of space weapon. And the bottom line there is a lot of times it's hard to tell the difference between them. So let me go on to the next chart here. In our Defense Against the Dark Arts report, we actually try to categorize different types of space defenses. That is, things you can do to protect yourself or mitigate attacks, all the different types of counter space attacks that Brian talked about. We divide them into several categories. So the biggest category are your active defenses versus your passive defenses. So active defenses are where you are proactively going out and trying to disrupt an attack before it can affect you. A passive defense, you're just trying to protect yourself against an attack once it happens and make yourself harder to attack, more resilient. So under active defenses, we further divide it into those that are based in space and those that are terrestrial based. And so some of your space-based active defenses is you could have jamming and spoofing capabilities or laser dazzling capabilities in space, either on your satellite or on a protective satellite, so that you can try to blind the sensors of an incoming ASAT warhead. It's similar to what we do on aircraft already. You can just do that in space. It could be on board or off board. And there are different advantages and disadvantages to doing that we discuss in more detail in the report. Of course, you could also have a shoot back capability where you kinetically fire a projectile at another satellite or an incoming warhead in order to protect yourself. The obvious drawback from that in the space domain is you create space debris when you do that. So that could actually end up hurting you and trashing the environment for others who may need to use similar orbits. And then of course there's physical seizure. And this is something that we didn't have on our list at first, but when we did a series of workshops and went through different space crisis scenarios with folks, this kept coming up as it seemed like it would be a valuable capability that people wanted in different scenarios. The ability to go out and grab an uncooperative object in space. It could be a piece of debris. It could be a piece of debris that's actually some sort of nefarious co-orbital asset of another country. It could be an overt counter space weapon, another satellite that's intentionally interfering with your satellite either through electronic or other means. And so that physical seizure capability certainly seems like something that would be useful in a lot of different scenarios. There are also terrestrial-based active defenses. You could go out and launch cyber attacks against the command and control infrastructure for another country's counter space weapons, right? So that they can't control or send commands or pass data among their different anti-satellite weapon systems. You could do jamming and spoofing from the ground to, for example, prevent an adversary from being able to send commands to co-orbital satellites that are in space. You could use a direct ascent ASAT weapon to shoot down a threatening satellite. Again, you've got the debris problem that creates. So it seems like that, is really a choice of last resort. And then, of course, you could use air, land, and sea-based kinetic attacks to go after the ground infrastructure that supports an adversary's ASAT capabilities. Although, keep in mind, if you do that, that could be forcing you to attack targets on the mainland of the other country, and that could be highly escalatory depending on where you are in the phase of conflict. Now, passive defenses are what we've traditionally focused on in space. One group of ways that you can better defend your space systems are architectural defenses. That is rethinking, redesigning the satellite constellations themselves. You can have, disaggregated constellations where you break up missions. So you don't have a lot of missions on the same satellite that makes it a juicy target for an adversary. You could break that up and have different missions on different types of satellites. You could have distributed constellations where you spread out capabilities across many satellites in a constellation. Proliferated constellations are a little different. That's where you have lots of copies of the same type of satellite. Diversified architectures are where you rely on multiple different types of orbits. It could include an aerial layer, terrestrial layer, right? Where you've got a very diversified architecture and you're not dependent on any one particular orbit or area. And then of course your ground stations, don't forget those. You can have redundant, mobile, hardened ground stations that make that segment of your space system more resilient. Then there are technical defenses that you can put on your satellites. And I would point out here, we already use a lot of these technical defenses on things like our protected satellite communication systems, things like advanced EHF and MILSTAR. But the first thing that stands out in those technical defenses, and this came up again in our workshops that we ran on this, is having better space domain awareness. Improving your ability to see and understand and characterize what's happening in the space domain, not just knowing where objects are, but knowing what they're doing, how they're communicating, what kind of capabilities they have on board. Improving that space domain awareness capability actually enhances almost all of your other defenses. It makes them more effective. And similar to that, doing radio frequency mapping from space, not just communications that are going on, from the ground to space, but also being able to map what's going on in the radio frequency spectrum in space to understand what people are doing, where things are coming from. You can add electromagnetic shielding to your satellites, which we do that for a lot of our more sophisticated satellites for missile warning and communications. You can use filtering and shuttering to better protect your optical and infrared sensing satellites. You can use jam-resistant waveforms, which we use in protected SATCOM. You can have antenna nulling, adaptive filtering. Of course, you should use encryption and have air-gapped ground stations. You'll be surprised, though, how many commercial systems don't do some of these basic things, and yet we rely on them for supplementing a lot of our military space-based capabilities. And then the last area of passive defenses are your operational defenses, right? Things you can do to change the way you operate in space, like having the ability to rapidly deploy satellites that can keep an adversary off guard. They can't figure it into their strategic planning if they don't know that it exists, and you deploy it rapidly once a conflict is about to begin or is underway. Reconstitution, that's the ability to replace satellites if they are damaged or destroyed. I would point out here, there are some major downsides to that. You're not going to launch more satellites to replace dead satellites if the adversary can just kill those as well, right? So reconstitution, that may actually have to wait until you're pretty far along in a conflict and you're confident that you have degraded their ability to attack you in space, in the way that they did that's causing you to have to replace systems. Of course, there's maneuver. In space, maneuver is very different than it is in the air domain. You're using a lot of propellant. Satellites are not generally designed to be highly maneuverable. I would commend you to a paper that Ash Carter wrote back in the 1980s when he was a congressional technology analyst. We talked about maneuver and how it was a losing game trying to outmaneuver an ASAT weapon in space. Of course, there's stealth. You can try to hide, or you can use deception and decoys. But as Brian talked about, a lot of our adversaries are making advances in their space situational awareness, space domain awareness capabilities. So are a lot of commercial companies. And so our ability to hide what we're doing in space is becoming more and more limited. So you can't rely on that necessarily as much as we used to. I also want to point out that there are a lot of dual use capabilities in space. So I'm borrowing some videos here. This experiment, I think it was conducted by a company, Surrey Satellite, out of the UK. What they're testing here are ways of cleaning up orbital debris. So perfectly benign, legitimate thing to be testing. On the left side, they're firing a harpoon so that in theory you could spear a piece of debris, reel it back in. And on the right-hand side, they're deploying a giant net that can wrap itself around a tumbling piece of debris or an out-of-control satellite, and you can reel that back in. Those are promising ways of cleaning up orbital debris, although who's going to pay for it is the big unknown. But to an adversary, to China, this could look like anti-satellite testing, because you could use these for nefarious purposes as well. You could use these against active satellites of someone. So when we see China, when we see Russia doing things in space, often we jump to the conclusion that they're doing it for nefarious purposes, and that might be right, but they could point at some of the things that we and our allies are doing in space and make the same claim. There are a lot of dual use capabilities out there, especially when it comes to things like remote proximity operations, that it's sometimes really unclear what the intent is, right? And that makes it a more challenging threat environment to work within, since there's so much ambiguity. The other big question that's out there in kind of international relations when it comes to space is, well, what constitutes a space weapon? What's allowed, what's not allowed? And the bottom line is it's not well defined. There aren't a lot of widely accepted agreements out there internationally when it comes to space, the largest being the Outer Space Treaty. It only prohibits some things. The main thing it prohibits in Earth orbit is you can't put weapons of mass destruction in orbit. They can pass through space like an ICBM, but you can't put nukes and station them in orbit. Okay, and the Partial Test Ban Treaty says you're not supposed to be detonating nuclear weapons in space. Well, we did that prior to the enactment of that treaty, and we found that, yeah, that was a pretty bad thing to do for everyone. So there's really no need to do that. But what else is prohibited? Not a lot, and that's why you see some efforts at the United Nations over the past really decade and a half to try to establish some limits. Of course, Russia and China have pushed their proposal, prevention and placement of weapons of mass destruction, something else in space, they call it PPWT. The European Union came out with their code of conduct. These things didn't really go that far, but it looks like we're making another push at that now. But really, it's fundamentally hard to reach an agreement to limit or ban something if you can't reach an agreement on what it is. So what is a space weapon? We looked at that, and basically there are a lot of different definitions. I use this framework as kind of a broad framework of everything that could possibly be considered a space weapon. And I divide it into 6 different categories you see here. On the top, we divide it by where the weapon is stationed and where it has effects. So Earth to space, or space to Earth, right? And then on the vertical here going down, divide it between whether it's kinetic or non-kinetic, right? And different people try to define space weapons in different ways. I think almost everyone would agree that a space-to-space kinetic weapon, that is a satellite in orbit that can kinetically destroy another satellite in orbit, almost everyone would agree that is a space weapon. Well, if you agree with that, then space has already been weaponized, because the Soviet Union, early in the Cold War, going back to the 1960s, tested systems just like this, a co-orbital kinetic ASAT weapon. I think they conducted about 20 tests of that system throughout the 1960s into the early 70s. So that's already happened. And the other yellow shaded areas here of this box are other types of potential space weapons that have also been publicly demonstrated. So, the bottom line is, I think we've got to move past this idea that we want to prevent the weaponization of space, because, hey, by nearly any definition, it's already been weaponized. We got to move past these arguments about whether or not space should be militarized. You know what? It's been used for military purposes since the beginning of the space age. What we really need to be focused on now is, what are we going to do about it, right? Our adversaries, Russia, China, and others, are increasingly building out their counter space forces. They're doing this as a deliberate way to attack one of the weaknesses in our battle networks and our ability to operate our forces in the future. And what it's up to us is to figure out better ways to defend our space systems, make them more resilient, make them more resistant to attack, so that they will not be such an attractive target for our adversaries. So with that, I'll pause, and I'll enjoy taking questions at the end.
All right, well, that was certainly a fantastic and sadly sobering overview of everything and the challenges that we face there. So with that, hopefully on a little happier note, we'll move over to Chris Stone and see what his take on all of this is. Chris?
Okay, so let me see if I can get my slides to work, and then we'll go from there. If not, I may just have to ask you, Brendan, to pull them up, because I'm on a weird setup here. Yeah, I think I might
Okay.
need you to help me out here.
Yep, no problem. Let me, they're up on
I'm on a
my
different
phone.
computer.
Okay. There we go. All right, there you go.
Here we go. Cool. So, sort of a different approach than Ryan and Todd. I'm gonna kind of discuss one way of explaining some of the how and the why regarding of what they're doing, plus some potential future things that might change some of our thinking on how to address future threats. Dealing with a theory of war called maneuver warfare. So go ahead and go to the next slide. So I'm just going to provide a little overview, some context, some of the stuff we've heard in the other panelists and in the previous session. So I won't belabor some of those, but we'll talk about some of this here a little bit. Go ahead. So as we kind of discussed, sort of a roundabout way, we have a defense-based strategy, and we've decided to state that we're now in a resurgent great power competition with the Chinese and the Russians, with China being the most immediate and serious threat, as they state in the defense-based strategy. Also, we also pretty much acknowledge across the DoD that space is a warfighting domain. It's no longer benign. It's no longer a sanctuary, if it ever was one. Some people could argue either way. But that in the Chinese context, that their strategic intentions and capabilities prevent the urgent and enduring threats to the ability for the Space Force and the DoD to achieve its desired conditions in space. And the reason why is, as we've mentioned with the previous panel and in some of the earlier stuff that we heard from Brian and Todd, is that they view space as important in modern warfare, and that counter-space capabilities are a means of reducing the U.S. allied and partner military effectiveness for winning future wars, again, mostly in the terrestrial side, but more and more looking at space as being a place where wars could start and possibly be won. And what I'm going to talk about is a little more of the how we could explain some of this from a different perspective. When I was here about 5 years ago, we talked about things from more of a strategic cultural standpoint, and today I'm going to be talking about how we can probably explain some of their space deterrence and warfighting posture activities through mobile warfare, or sometimes also called on our side of things, maneuver warfare for strategic advantage. Next slide. So as was mentioned in the first panel, the PLA has been observing how we've been doing space integration in our terrestrial conflicts for decades, at least since the 1991 Gulf War. And they've concluded that because of their fairly non-effective conventional and nuclear forces at the time, and our superior nuclear and conventional forces at the time, that it would be pretty much unwise to counter us from where our strengths were. And we had moved to a lot of maneuver warfare-based thinking in the air, land, and sea services as well. And so they've decided, from all the readings that I've done, that waging an attrition positional warfare kind of concept against the United States to protect their interests would probably be less wise. So over the last 30 years or so, we've seen them begin more of a holistic military strategy shift that seeks modernization of their conventional nuclear forces, both in capability and in numbers, underpinned by a space deterrence and warfighting option thought that one could easily argue is based on mobile or maneuver warfare theory. Go ahead to the next slide, please. So for those that are out there that are wondering what that is, there's a difference between maneuver as in moving a spacecraft or an aircraft or a ship. Maneuver warfare, I think one of the best definitions is the Marine Corps warfighting document, defines it as warfighting philosophy that seeks to shatter an enemy's cohesion through a series of rapid, focused, and unexpected actions, which can create a turbulent or rapidly deteriorating situation which the enemy cannot cope. So, and put in a shorter phrase, they seek to defeat the enemy through means other than attacking their strength. If you look in some of the old strategic writings of like Karl von Clausewitz that many of us are familiar with, his view was that hitting the center of gravity, which in their view was the strong point, was a way to a decisive action. Maneuver warfare theory, however, defines the center of gravity as the enemy's critical vulnerability or one of their critical vulnerabilities rather than aiming at their strength. And Sun Tzu has similar views on warfare as well. So that kind of fits. And so China believes that as a vital center of gravity in US warfighting, as well as warfighting in general, as we heard earlier, has moved into the space world. And that they believe that, as others have stated, it's a vulnerability for the United States, or what they have sometimes referred to as our soft ribs. So maneuver strategy would seek the following objectives, and these can be done individually or mutually supporting. One that we would call preemption, or defeating or neutralizing the enemy before the fight happens. Dislocation, rendering the enemy's strengths irrelevant by removing the enemy from the decisive point or removing the point altogether, and that could be a point in space, in the space context, or it could be hurting their ability to do effective warfighting in the terrestrial areas. And then disruption, neutralizing the enemy by attacking or threatening the center of gravity, which disruption and preemption are basically different layers of each other in the space context. Next slide. So some manifestations of maneuver warfare theory in a lot of the Chinese strategy documents, some of which have been earlier discussed shortly, is when you're talking about what we would call preemption or defeating, neutralizing the enemy, the Chinese have a unique view of space deterrence and warfighting from a lot of the Western viewpoints, where we tend to view a posture of strength, that if you attack us, we will respond. As was mentioned with Kevin early on, they have a view of more of an active deterrence posture, or in some writings is referred to as attacking to deter, where if they believe that actions being done by the United States or some other country is maneuvering forces, including satellites, into a battlefield prep or into another means of likely attack on a terrestrial standpoint, then they reserve the right to deter that action from attacking them through a preemptive attack. And that includes space to space, space to ground, or ground to ground, with what they consider space warfare to possibly end up including rapid and destructive strikes. They, as many people have started to talk about on our side of the ocean, is that a good space deterrent capability would ensure that one's ability to use space for terrestrial actions or for other interests need to be preserved, while at the same time limiting, weakening, or destroying the adversary space forces, both the ones providing space support to terrestrial or counter-space forces that are deployed in space or on the ground. On the dislocations objective of maneuver warfare type theory, rendering enemy strength irrelevant, the focus is of rendering US terrestrial forces less effective through either a psychological or physical effects. So in maneuver warfare, as I mentioned earlier, it's not just about moving a force or a satellite or an airplane or whatever. It's both a physical effect that impacts a psychological effect of sorts within the commander or in the strategic leadership of a country. So just because we may have a disaggregated construct as a way to kind of defending against a kinetic interceptor or directed energy, doesn't mean that their goal is to destroy all of our stuff in a conflict, or even in a period of tension, as they call it. It could also be just to do just enough damage to create some psychological concern that might create pause in the mind of an adversary from continuing with the path that they're on militarily or political militarily. And what they would do is, as it says in their writings, to choose the appropriate deterrence means to display the horribleness, severity, or urgency of the consequences in what they refer to as space struggle. And as I mentioned earlier just a second ago, this is not just a dominant battlefield for war, but they could see the use of space in what we used to call phase zero, or shaping environment of the pre-conflict or pre-gaining initiative, and what they call periods of tension. So a period of tension, sometimes in Chinese writings, mobile warfare could include creating a crisis that could be used for psychological advantage to prevent an action on the part of one's adversary. And all this to preserve the sovereignty, what they call sovereignty control of Chinese territory, and expanding core interests that the PLA must first seize the initiative in space. And that seizing the initiative could be a multitude of different ways they could do that, from a demonstration of a capability to a full out limited strike to a demonstration, as Kevin said, that, hey, we mean business and this is what we're able to do. Next slide. And then finally, disruption, neutralizing the enemy by attacking or threatening. This goes again, as I mentioned, with the preemptive standpoint, because of their deterrent viewpoint, having a proactive ability and stance to it. Noticing in red there, it could be threatening or attacking. So sometimes disrupting an enemy center of gravity could be just threatening it by demonstrating a capability, which some could argue a lot of their ASAT tests were not just testing for the sake of having a capability they could deploy, but also as a capability demonstrator that might be seen as a threatening action to prevent the United States from doing certain activities in space that might hinder the PLA or the Chinese government's objectives on the terrestrial sphere, whether it's South China Sea, Taiwan, or whatever. As I mentioned, and other people have mentioned earlier, that the center of gravity, they believe, has moved to space. And as we mentioned also, that they believe, this is a quote from one of their many documents, that whoever is a strong man of military space will be the ruler of the battlefield, and whoever has advantages of space has the power of the initiative. And without that, you lose, and with it, you will be able to enable victory. And so space superiority, in their minds, is the more traditional viewpoint that we had of space superiority. A lot of times now, when people use the phrase space superiority, they're talking more of a technological superiority, whereas in most of the writings that they've written on the topic, it's dealing more with achieving control or blockade capabilities in certain areas or zones, as they refer to it, in the space domain, to achieve that ability to gain victory over the enemy. And then lastly, it says it includes combat potentially to safeguard themselves and destroy the enemy's defenses in outer space. So while we like to discuss the whole, what's called horizontal escalation of using other domains of our choosing to respond, a lot of what the Chinese view their capability expansion is more on the vertical sphere, their ability to go escalate from a reversible standpoint of like jammers up to a non-reversible standpoint of a directed energy or a kinetic interceptor. And while we believe that there are ways to defend space up to a certain point, a lot of Chinese writings indicate that they believe that space is easy to attack and difficult to defend, and a low threshold activity given our lack of ability to respond, or our lack of responses over the years with some of the more lower threshold modes of interference that have been mentioned in public hearings and things of that sort by the Department of Defense and NRO activity. Next slide. So I think if you look at that theory and some of what their writings and some of their activities have been over the last 20, 30 years in their development of their space and counterspace forces, everything from launch to kinetic interceptors to directed energy, I think you can see that that they're working on ways to achieve sort of this maneuver warfare where they're going around our areas of strength in the terrestrial warfighting capability and deterrence capability, and using our vulnerability as a main area that they would use early in a conflict or a period of tension to try to limit our ability to achieve any objectives that's contrary to their own. Next slide, please. So next steps, there have been some papers written by some Chinese scientists related to the PLA regarding steps towards what they are calling enhanced maneuver, whereas you're dealing with not just the ability to maneuver a satellite with chemical propulsion, which we've talked about co-orbital ASATs and things of that sort that Brian and Todd mentioned well earlier, but they're looking at trying to move from a more positional constellational based posture for their deterrence and warfighting capability and even some of their exploratory capability into a more maneuver for what they've termed fleet-based posture by 2045, which also coincides with, as Kevin mentioned, when they want to be a first-rate power in space. And a lot of that is dealing with a sort of a resurgence and interest in space nuclear thermal propulsion to be able to do that. And they're saying that this requirement comes from the fact that they need high power and enhanced mobility for defensive applications, because they believe that as their defense integration of space advances with their terrestrial forces, the threats of these systems require capability to be able to cross vast distances of space in Earth orbits more rapidly with a reasonably sized vehicle, and also out to cislunar space. So with them putting communications relays out at L2, which is a Lagrange point on the far side of the moon, and potentially launching another one, there are a lot of people who are concerned with that possibility as they move out and their economic interests expand to the resource utilization or the space solar power stuff that Kevin mentioned earlier, that they're going to want to have quicker abilities to get out there and protect their vital interests as they see it expanding in that realm, as well as across the three main major orbital regimes. And so they think that nuclear vessels could potentially help them with solar system exploration. But from a defense application standpoint, they believe that having long-term mobile warfare capable space systems, such as that could be provided potentially through nuclear thermal propulsion fleets or some operational capability in the near term before 2045, that would help them advance their industrial and economic dominance objectives in cislunar system. So we'll have to see what happens with that, but it seems like a lot of countries are looking into this. It's not just the United States with DARPA with their Draco project, but also I've seen some UK efforts that are looking into that, and as well as the Chinese. So this is something that would be definitely interesting to see how that works out. Next slide. So one of the things that I've written before, and I think would behoove us to do, is while there are some concerns about some of the capabilities that the Chinese have deployed per a worldwide threat assessment, open source discussions such as the low Earth orbit kinetic interceptors and some directed energy systems and some dazzling lasers and things of that sort. I think it would be good for us to build similar capabilities in addition to some of the orbital warfare accessible capabilities that we're looking at doing, both offensive and defensive. And then because of one of the things that I did mention earlier, that they're seeing that makes our constellation-based structure of chemical propellant-based systems, as was mentioned earlier a little bit, was that if you're trying to maneuver out of the way of a weapon system, whatever it is, a directed energy laser or an ASAT, that uses chemical propellant on board that is only designed for a certain lifespan. And so when you have a chemical burning system versus a nuclear thermal propulsion-based system, nuclear thermal has a lot more propulsion efficiency, propellant efficiency than a chemical propellant. And it gives you the ability to go over longer distances and burn longer and more rapidly than you would get out of a chemical propulsion system without having some means of refueling. And so that's another reason why they're looking at nuclear thermal, and why we're also looking at that in the DARPA sphere of RDT&E. So eventually, I think it would be wise for us to transition to a more mixed fleet, where a lot of our deterrence and warfighting capabilities that need to provide an effect in a certain area of orbital space or in cislunar space would be able to do that a little bit quicker for both orbital and cislunar, as I said. So with that, that is my presentation for the day, a little bit about maneuver warfare. Looking forward to questions.
All right, well, thanks for that. Certainly didn't make our lives any easier because we didn't have to worry about just what they had. Now you laid out a good case for what are they going to try to do with it? How are they going to use psychological ops and just continue to complicate matters? And it's not, again, it goes back to the first panel, you know, in my view, space is the ultimate gray zone, you know, and unless you're actually shooting one satellite with another, something you can track, it's just really, really hard to tell what's going on. Some of that's intentional, some of it's not intentional. How do we parse it? What happens if we get it wrong? And so thanks for that. I appreciate the overview from everyone and some good competing ideas and policy recommendations there. So I guess one of the, well, first, why don't we go with Kristen's question? So while I try to phrase the question in my head, which is I think a bigger one, she was asking about the dark arts conversation about space to ground weapons. You know, what are we seeing? What's the future of that? How scary are these? You know, I mean, how close are we to getting them?
Yeah.
So go ahead, sorry, go ahead, Todd.
Oh yeah, so yeah, I jump in on that. So the U.S. has talked about this in the past. Ideas like rods from God or space-based lasers that were part of the the Strategic Defense Initiative. the fact of the matter is, for kinetic strike, putting those objects in orbit is far less effective and efficient than just keeping them on Earth and firing them on ballistic missiles. You can run the analysis on it. You'll see that you have to have a huge constellation in orbit. It will take a lot to keep that constellation up and keep replenishing it. And even then, it's still vulnerable to an adversary attacking it and creating holes in the constellation. And so, yeah, you're far better off just keeping it on Earth. And that's why, you know, the ban on or stationing nuclear weapons in orbit, you know, hasn't really been challenged, because it's better from a physics perspective to keep them in silos. Keep your nuclear weapons on missiles in silos is far more effective way to hold targets at risk than to try to base those things in orbit. Now, for non-kinetic space-to-Earth weapons, the challenge there is building something like a laser or high-power microwave that is a high enough power level that you could put it in space and still have effects that are meaningful, if not on the surface of the Earth, at least at high altitudes. That has been a real technical challenge. Folks in the directed energy community keep telling us that they're just around the corner from that technology, and they keep saying that it's always 5 years away, always 5 years away. But again, you know, you get to the constellation size, right? So for directed energy weapons in space, you know, their effectiveness decreases with the square of distance. And so you don't want to be at high orbits like geostationary orbit, right? You want to be at low orbits. When you're at low orbits, you're constantly moving relative to the surface of the Earth. So you need a very large constellation to always have one or two of these satellites within view of wherever you might need them. So again, it becomes not just a technology problem, it's a constellation size problem. And I don't think that, these things are going to be figured out anytime in the near future. If China wants to pour a bunch of money into these technologies, great. We should encourage it because it's not going to be an effective use of their money, at least not in the foreseeable future.
So just to build on that, and one more thing, I agree with Todd's analysis. Say this always has to be a cross-domain discussion, right? There are some capabilities that are really effective to use from space, a lot of remote sensing, PNT, but there are other capabilities like delivering these sorts of kinetic effects that, at least today with the technology we have in mind, are just much more efficient and effective when delivered through other means, through air domain, that sort of thing. The other piece I want to add to this is my sense is a lot of the Chinese concern about SDI and space-based missile defense, also shared by the Russians, is not necessarily the space to ground effects. It's the effect it might have on their nuclear deterrent. They're very concerned about, should the US's rhetoric on missile defense and space-based missile defense ever match what it can actually do, that will undermine their nuclear deterrent, and then they're in a real problem. So there's, again, this is more with the Russians than with China, but I think it's also an element of what the Chinese are thinking is, I get a sense that a lot of their concern is, A, what can they do from a diplomatic legal perspective, try and block space-based missile defense that could, be this, but also, developing ground-based anti-satellite weapons that could take out those space-based platforms. It's not, that's also a way to hedge their bets should the US ever be able to do this.
If I can be the devil's advocate, there are some reports out there regarding space to ground that are written by physics people that one of the main concerns that was keeping this from being a reality was the cost of launch. So to be able to get enough revisit rate on targeting was how much can you launch up there, especially given the size of some of these tungsten lead rods that they were talking about during the 80s and early 90s. But with the lowering of the cost of launch by reusability and things of that sort from SpaceX, there are some reports that have been out that claim that for the cost of one or two carrier strike groups that we put in our money into, that you could have multiple orbits of these things with revisit rates of 5 minutes or less on any population center of 2,000 people or more. And depending on the orbital altitude and how you deploy them, you could have explosive energy characteristics equal to standard airdrop bombs all the way up to low yield nuclear weapons without radiation. So just for sake of discussion, I throw that out there for people to consider that it may be more efficient in our mind how we've always done things, but I wouldn't hold out the chance that the Chinese won't be innovative and think that this won't be a way to hold things at risk, because we don't have the ability to shoot them down, at least not in the numbers necessary to counter something like that. So just for discussion, something to think about.
And I mean, we did one of those reports, ultra low cost access to space, and looking at what missions might become viable or more viable if the cost of launch was cut by a factor of 10 or a factor of 100. But we found that the cost of launch alone just wasn't a driving factor in deploying these large constellations, and that it's the cost of the systems themselves and the fact that you have to keep replenishing them. And we compared it not to a carrier strike group, because that doesn't provide equivalent capability. It's a ballistic missile force that provides the equivalent capability to strike targets anywhere on Earth with a conventional warhead. And when you compare it to the cost of a ballistic missile force, it's just orders of magnitude more expensive. So I think China's already made their decision. They're building out their ballistic missile force, and it's been very effective. And we have a very hard time countering missile salvos right now. So I don't see why they would want to try some risky, expensive approach. But like Brian said, there are some missions, many missions, that actually do make a lot of sense to move to space. Sensing, remote sensing is a prime area. And I think one of the things we're going to see moving to space more and more is ground moving target indication, GMTI, and airborne moving target indication. You can put up, and private companies are already doing this, putting up constellations of small satellites with synthetic aperture radars that can do AMTI and GMTI. Now you start thinking about the consequences of that. If China is able to do AMTI from space, so they could see over very large areas of the Earth, if not the whole Earth, at once, all the way into our territory, into our allies' territories, way behind the front lines, and they're shooting radar from above. Our stealthy aircraft aren't designed for that. That creates a real problem for us. Those are some of the challenges we ought to be really thinking about, and that is a near-term risk, a near-term mission that could be done today from space with existing technology.
Mostly.
Well, I think that, go ahead.
I was just going to say, when that report that I was referencing was describing the carrier striker from a standpoint of presence and time on target, not so much ballistic missile related items. So just for added clarification.
I think it's a great debate point, and to kind of throw things even further, Kevin's got a question in the chat there that talks about the value and effectiveness of launching counter-space attacks from cislunar space, right? Because we're worried about all of these things. So thoughts on that? Anybody have a comment back to Kevin?
Yeah, I'll go first. I'm skeptical of that just because it is so darn far away, right? The moon is 400,000 kilometers away. It's, you think about the time span of, a direct descent ASAT from the Earth to low Earth orbit is measured in several minutes. Direct descent ASAT to get to GEO is measured in several hours. Coming from cislunar down is even much longer time. I think the best argument I've heard is that, well, we're not watching that, so they may be able to catch us by surprise. Sure, but I'm not sold on it just because the cost of putting together something that's going to be effective, right? It's going to be military effective. It's going to be robust. It's going to be able to target multiple satellites. Is daunting. Also, how they do command and control of it is another question. How they're going to target it, and if then the solution is we just put some sensor out to watch cislunar space. That's sort of I think an easier way to counter that. So anyways, I know people have talked about that. I am much less concerned about it. I think the biggest issue with cislunar at the moment is we just don't have a lot of situational awareness about it, right? Traditionally, the DoD's mission was from GEO in, right? Their focus was on tracking stuff in cislunar space, and they left, tracking stuff in Earth orbit, and they left cislunar and beyond essentially to NASA, right? So NASA has a deep space network and other things to track things. So I think the challenge is we just don't know, and so there's definitely a conversation about how does the Space Force or U.S. Spacecom, get a better handle on what's happening in cislunar space. But I'll just say, just even that itself is extraordinarily daunting, given how big it is relative to Earth orbit, and we are still struggling with having good coverage, SSA, SDA, of Earth orbit just by itself.
Yeah, as you were saying, Brian, we don't really have a lot of coverage out there, and that is one, I think, a legitimate concern if they were to do that. With chemical related systems, yeah, it does take a long time. If they eventually get to the nuclear thermal, that could shrink that down a little bit. Hopefully by then, though, we'll have increased that. But even if they did do a chemical based, thrusted, counter-space system from cislunar space, and we don't have the ability to track it, tracking it alone is not going to stop the attack. And if we don't have the ability to deny that, whether it's a kinetic capability or just a vehicle that moves around and then takes a position in one of our SOCI holes, then we still are lacking the ability to defend ourselves. Just watching it doesn't really help a whole lot, other than, oh, at least we know that they're doing it. So we need both, essentially.
Well, and to put some numbers on it, the distance of the moon is about 10 times as far as geostationary orbit. Traveling at the speed of light, a signal takes about 2.5 seconds round trip to go from the Earth to the moon. Physically traveling, propelling an object, the Apollo spacecraft took about 3 days each direction. Now, you could speed that up by traveling faster. Your propellant requirements, though, then increase exponentially, because not only do you have to accelerate more, you have to decelerate more on the other end. So you're talking, maybe you could do it in 2 days, right? So if you're okay with a weapon system that when you need to call on it, it's 2 days before it has effects, okay. I don't see how there's that much military utility in that. And because the moon is so distant from the Earth, it's not a good place to do remote sensing, because again, your resolution and everything, all of those, and sensing, signals and things like that, that all falls off with the distance squared. So you're 10 times higher than GEO. We don't even try to do much remote sensing in GEO. But 10 times higher than that, it's really kind of out of the question that you could do anything reasonable. But yeah, if there was a threat approaching from cislunar space, what are you going to do about it? I think the job for space domain awareness in cislunar space, that really falls in the job jar for NASA at this point. Because going to the moon, in and around the moon, that's really for science and exploration. That's true for China as well, if you really look at what they're doing. And so that should be a good job for NASA, maybe in some collaboration with the Space Force to learn from their expertise in Earth orbit and to share data. And maybe in 20 or 30 years, it starts to become more of a military mission out to cislunar space. But I don't think we're going to see that happen until there is something of economic significance going on in or around the moon. And once there's some sort of significant line of commerce between the moon and the Earth, then wherever commerce goes, conflict inevitably follows. So then there might be a mission for the Space Force, but for now, let's keep it real. Earth orbit. It's a little bit outside of GEO into Earth. That's where we need to be focused and not get distracted by the Netflix series Space Force.
I would serve again as a devil's advocate. I would say that because it takes so long currently, even with some of the special acquisition authorities that we're playing with, to address situations and problems, we're still trying to deal with problems that we've had for 30 years, as you mentioned, in GEO. But I wouldn't consider cislunar to be a distraction. I consider it's part of a whole. Because traveling out to the moon is just another extended orbit. It's just a little bit further on, 240,000 miles, like you said. And because the Chinese are maneuvering some things out there that they have intentions, economic as well as potential military applications out there, I think it would be foolish for the Space Force to say that's a distraction and not think of it and not work on what their force posture and force design should be to deal with all the current Earth orbital regimes that we're dealing with right now, the Counterspace systems addressing those, as well as cislunar. Because I think if we continue to take the same approach we've been doing for the last 30 years of waiting until something happens, then we're going to be behind the power curve. It's going to cost us even more money and a lot more time, and that puts us more at risk for potential adversary activities to be superior than ours is currently. So I think it's probably not very wise to wait until something happens to think about it.
Well, all three of you mentioned physics a couple of times, which sparked two questions for me, right? So the first one is not necessarily a space question, but it's more, hey, we've made a lot of advances in physics. It's probably the one area where the Chinese are on par, perhaps more advanced than we are, and that's hypersonics, right? So not necessarily hypersonics in space, but certainly a lot of them are going to go through space, and they're going to have some effect on our space-based assets and whatnot. So I'll just throw it out there kind of as an open topic.
Yeah.
What is the impact of Chinese hypersonic technology going to do to our space and their counter space capabilities?
So everything in space is hypersonic, just to kind of put it that way, right? So we're kind of the OG hypersonic is great kind of a domain. Honestly, not much. So hypersonic weapons that we're talking about are ICB or ballistic missile boosted glide vehicles, or some sort of single stage atmospheric glider. They're gliding through the atmosphere. They're not in space, and for them to be able to do something against the space asset, they would actually have to then turn and actually go into space. And so if that's the case, just use a typical ballistic missile, right? A direct ascent ASAT weapon. I think the link there is the role of space in detecting and being able to defend against hypersonic weapons, right? That's perfectly feasible to do. Is Todd mentioned, space is great for observing stuff. The challenge is a lot of the current U.S. capabilities for missile warning and missile tracking are designed to detect ballistic targets, not hypersonic glide targets. So a little bit different sensor phenomenology, different types of target characterization, a little bit different timeliness. Even though hypersonic weapons move slower than ICBMs, they move differently. And so that may actually, even though they take longer to get there, they may actually end up being harder to detect using the existing things. So there is a big connection there in terms of the role of space in detecting and defending against hypersonic glide weapons. I don't see them as a threat to space systems. Now, talk about ground systems, sure, right? Because if you could talk about the hypersonic glide vehicle could be used to take out a ground control center, just like a JDAM or something else. Maybe that aspect of it, but not against the satellites themselves.
Yeah, I completely agree with Brian. I don't think the hypersonic weapons are a direct threat to space capabilities any more than they are to other terrestrial, ground stations that could be affected by them. But the big change is the hypersonic missile threat we see coming from China means a new space mission for us. Because our current space systems are not designed to detect and track hypersonic missiles. They're not optimized for that. And so we've got to build new capabilities in different orbits with different types of sensors that can track these systems more reliably, more accurately across the full duration of their flight. And a key discriminator is they are maneuverable. And you can't just track a ballistic trajectory and then drop off once it gets out of infrared coverage and say, well, we have a pretty good idea of where it's going to go because it's ballistic. That doesn't work with the hypersonic weapons that are maneuverable. So this is a whole new mission, and it is ideal to be done from space.
Yeah, I have 2 points on the hypersonic thing. One says both Brian and Todd mentioned is the sensor piece from space, which is huge. That's why you're seeing current programs like Next Gen OPIR funded in the Space Force budget. That's why you're seeing the Space Development Agency working on their tracking layers and things of that sort. And then another piece of it would be if there is going to be a space-based missile defense architecture, like people are talking about again, are we going to be able to track them, as Todd mentioned, all the way through their flight paths from boost, mid-course to terminal, and be able to engage them. On another side point, hypersonics, the story of hypersonics and our competition between the Chinese and the Russians and stuff on that is that many people would argue that we're behind and that we could have been ahead had we invested more into this years ago, but we didn't think we really needed it at the time. And so rather than being a little bit more forward leaning on that, we're behind that. And so some people are arguing you should just not even worry about hypersonics from our side, just look at defenses on how to deal with them and then go to the next thing, try to leapfrog them. And one of those arguments could be made about nuclear thermal propulsion, how we talk about chemical propulsion a lot. And if the Chinese are really looking at pursuing this from a standpoint of adding more agility and maneuverability and more rapidity with their responsiveness and stuff in space, then maybe we should consider that hypersonics is the lessons learned that maybe we don't want to repeat in the space domain with nuclear thermal and other technologies that maybe we could have been more ahead on 30 years ago, but we just decided not to pursue for various policy reasons.
Brendan, there's a question earlier, I think, from Kristen about difference between missile defense test and ASAT tests. I'm happy to address that. If that's all right. Yeah. So in the chat, Kristen asked, the challenge, the difference between a potential ASAT test and a ballistic missile test, and I think she meant to add ballistic missile defense test. That's a huge challenge, particularly for those working in the open source that don't have access to, SBIRS feed and that kind of stuff. So a couple things here. One, the challenge is because they're very similar, right? They're involved, let's talk first about a ballistic missile launch, right? You launch a rocket from the ground, the rocket stages burn out, they leave a payload which goes up into space, maybe several hundred kilometers to more than 1,500 kilometers, depending upon how far it's going, and then that payload re-enters the atmosphere and lands somewhere on the Earth. If you're doing a missile defense test, then you launch that, and then you launch another ballistic missile that has, instead of a payload, a warhead that's supposed to impact the Earth, it's got a kill vehicle that is trying to intercept and collide with the warhead, the ballistic missile warhead. And then if you're talking about an antisatellite test, you're launching a missile from the ground, it's got a kill vehicle on top, but instead of the kill vehicle trying to collide with the ballistic warhead, it's trying to collide with a satellite. And it's, that hit to kill missile defense technology and the, direct descent ASAT kinetic kill technology are essentially the same thing. The only way to really tell whether it was, actually missile defense test or whether it was an ASAT test is to look at the target. Did it intercept, or was it aimed at an orbiting satellite versus a ballistic warhead? But even that is hard to do, because after China did that test 2007, their subsequent tests of the same system were all, as far as we can tell, were all against ballistic warheads, right? So they didn't test it against a satellite in such a way that it could create orbital debris. They tested it against a ballistic warhead. So when it's destroyed, the fragments all fall back into the atmosphere and don't remain in space. And so they've sort of escaped similar international outrage like they generated in 2007 because of all the long-lived orbital debris. So in that case, we, in our assessments, we basically treat all the hit-to-kill missile defense as essentially a dual purpose, also capable of doing direct descent ASAT testing. And once a system has been shown to be able to hit a satellite, or there's policy or open declarations from the government saying this is intended to be an anti-satellite capability, we just treat it as such. That's how we do it. Now that's obviously a little bit fuzzy, but just given the overlaps in the technology and what we have, kind of the open source data, it's really, really hard to separate those. And of course, that also makes it really difficult to then have a discussion on sort of limits on that sort of technology you're testing, right? Because, for every country that says, yeah, destroying satellites is a bad thing, generally a lot of countries are also interested in missile defense, right? So how do you put a limit on the ability to destroy a satellite, some sort of, agreement or moratorium or arms control, while still allowing for hit to kill missile defense testing and research? That's a really thorny problem that we just haven't figured a way through yet.
Yeah, that's a great summation, and you kind of hit on, my second physics question, which actually ties into Sean's question there in the chat. Only one thing can occupy one space at one time, and as we create all this orbital debris, right, either from the ASAT tests or just more and more satellites going up there, what does that do to limiting the capabilities of space capabilities of the US or China for that matter, or our ability to retaliate just for fear of creating so much debris that we're then gonna, essentially frag our own satellites and things like that. So what are those kind of considerations? How real are they? And what are the Chinese thinking about it? And one of the ways you could create maybe not small pieces of orbital debris, but entire satellites would be the EMP question that Sean's talking about in the chat. So I'll throw that one open to anyone.
Yeah, I'll jump on that first if panelists don't mind. So in terms of the EMP threat, electromagnetic pulse weapon in space, that's been tested before. The way to do that, generate a large EMP, is with a nuclear weapon. If you want to Google the Starfish Prime test, the United States conducted, I think, back in 1962, prior to the test ban treaty. We detonated a megaton nuclear weapon at an altitude of about 400 kilometers in space, just to measure what it would do. The Soviets had done similar tests. They didn't use megaton weapons, but they did do similar altitudes. They actually did one during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So that's interesting. We did that and then realized, it has a lot of indiscriminate effects. So what happens is, there is the initial pulse. So any satellites that are in the vicinity right then, they're going to get hit with that pulse. Their electronics could get severely damaged or destroyed from that. But even if they're not in the immediate vicinity, what happens is it releases a lot of charged radioactive particles, and it charges up the Van Allen radiation belts in space, and it creates a much worse radiation environment for satellites. And what that does is, over time, it degrades the processors and memory chips and things on satellites and causes them to malfunction. And I read some estimates, and it's hard to know for sure. There weren't that many satellites in space at the time, but after the Starfish Prime test, some people have estimated that roughly a third of all satellites in space ultimately had their life cut short because of that test, because of the massive radiation effects it had in space. So both the United States and the Soviets quickly realized these were not good weapons, that they had indiscriminate effects, and we would be hurting our own space systems if we did it. Now, once you charge up the Van Allen radiation belts, that radiation level does gradually come down over time. It takes months or years, depending on how large of a blast. But yeah, could China do that? Absolutely. Could North Korea do it? Probably. It's not that big of a stretch. Would China want to do it? I think they've got way too much to lose in space. They're putting up a human, rated space station right now. They'd be giving that up. They'd be destroying it. And they would, quite frankly, piss off everyone else in the world who relies on satellites in low Earth orbit and maybe even some higher orbits as well. Also, keep in mind, when you charge up the Van Allen radiation belts, that's not going to affect satellites out in GEO, except when they try to communicate through it. So it actually creates a lot of interference when you're trying to pass signals through it when you've charged up those radiation belts. So it could end up interfering with signals from satellites in those higher orbits, even if they aren't directly damaged or destroyed from it. So I don't think it's a useful weapon for a country like China. It's more of a terrorist type attack. Right? Terrorists aren't going to have access to that kind of capability, at least not right now. Cross our fingers. Could a rogue state like North Korea use it? Potentially, but that is a weapon of last resort, I think. And so far, in our space threat assessment, you know, looking at North Korea, we don't see any indications that their nuclear weapons or ballistic missile programs are actually intended for anything other than nuclear effects on Earth. We don't see any indication that they're aspiring to use these systems in space.
Just to quickly add on to that, space is, you know, let's think about EMP, right? So it's, you know, it's charged particles and electrons, that kind of stuff, voltage differentials. Space is already full of that, as Todd mentioned, right? Because, you know, especially the Van Allen radiation belts, which dip down as low as 400 kilometers. Then you've got sort of the ones medium Earth orbit. A lot of the existing U.S. military satellites are already hardened against radiation effects because either they're designed to, like GPS operates in a high radiation environment, or they were designed for nuclear warfighting. Again, GPS and some of the, you know, the military communication satellites, AHF kind of a thing. So, you know, I think that further reinforces sort of Todd's point that, you know, sort of an indiscriminate EMP weapon in space is probably not a great military weapon, because a lot of the U.S. military satellites are hardened against it. It's more of a, you know, going after commercial or sort of assaulting the Earth strategies you mentioned. I'll just add a small counterpoint. There are sort of, you know, what I've seen discussions of smaller scale EMP. This is more in sort of the maybe the high energy or high radio frequency microwave or the HERF gun kind of a thing. Talking about maybe you could do that from a shorter distance, targeted at one satellite as a way to, you know, temporarily impair it or whatever. That certainly may be feasible as part of a, you know, a core relay-sat, but that is something that is usually people say EMP, they're talking about sort of the widespread EMP generated by a nuclear detonation.
I'll also throw in there about satellite hardening to what Brian was saying, is that there are a lot of people who are concerned about EMP, but there are others that are more concerned about a natural phenomenon with coronal mass ejections. That could be like there was a thing called a Carrington event, that not all satellites in orbit are hardened for that level of solar radiation effects, even with the Van Allen radiation belts. Back when the Carrington event happened in the 1800s, there were no satellites, but the Earth was seeing impacts of like frying and exploding telegraph lines and things of that sort. So I think if we were going to be concerned about an EMP event, it would be probably something more natural. But, you know, keeping in mind that you know, the potential for rogue states like North Korea, as Todd mentioned.
All right, and well, with
Brendan,
that,
hey,
yep, go ahead.
Brendan, I saw another question about doctrine from Kristen. You want me to throw that out real quick?
Yeah, please go ahead.
So the question was about, you know, was there an overview of foreign military history, doctrine, policy, and U.S. doctrine? And I'm assuming you mean in development of U.S. doctrine. From my experience, I mean, most folks that are engaged in helping develop doctrine, whether it's joint doctrine or service doctrine, are familiar with intelligence updates on what's going on. But from my experience, I've never seen a get together, you know, hey, let's look at what the adversary is thinking doctrinally so we can make our doctrine better. It's typically more made in a vacuum of this is what we want to do with our stuff. And sometimes you even see it where the doctrine is trying to be, is attempted to be fitted to make sense to other services rather than be more forward leaning on how we should do things. So I'm hoping to see a difference in that. And I think with the current Primer Space Power Capstone document that came out a year or so ago, that's probably a good start. And I think the Space Force will hopefully do a better job in that area in the future.
And there's an interesting article that Representative Jim Cooper, who's the chairman of the Strategic Forces Subcommittee and the House Armed Services Committee, he published an article recently in War on the Rocks, highly critical of the Space Force for its doctrine and its lack of imagination and thinking through you know, warfighting scenarios and how they would respond to attacks in space. So you know, if you want to read something provocative about that, I'd highly recommend his article to you.
And I would also add that with people who are critical of the Space Force, there are people that I've talked to in the Space Force that say, we're not even fully up and running yet. So Yeah, we're working that, but we're working on getting field commands up and running and making sure that we're having the right budgets. So whether people buy that argument or not, I don't think Mr. Cooper does, but just for that added piece of.
Yeah, well, with that, we're bumping up against time, but certainly I'll refer you back to the beginning slides that listed all the fine reports that that are out there that you guys have done. I really appreciate you guys taking some time to talk through this with us and with our partners here at ACC. I know it was super valuable, super informative to me. You know, I look at these things every day, but you know, I learned a whole lot through this discussion. So. Thank you again, CSIS, Secure World Foundation, AFA, Brian, Chris, and Todd. I appreciate the facts there that you took some time to join us today and made yourself available to this audience. So with that, on behalf of ACC and the team here at CASI, super glad you were able to join us. Again, reach out to us directly, and we'll be able to hook you up with the video or the links to link up with anybody here. Continue the discussion, and we look forward to the next quarterly event. So with that, thank you very much, and thanks to Kevin and Kristen for the first panel who've managed to hang on the whole time. And with that, I will bid you a very good afternoon. Thank you.